Okay, welcome to your KIN 425 lecture. In this section, I'm covering exercise and alterations in atmospheric pressure. So this refers to both altitude, where your atmospheric pressure is decreased, and diving, where your atmospheric pressure is increased. In this part, this is part one of the section on altitude specifically. So a few definitions to go over first. Hypobaria, hypoxia, and hypoxemia. Hypobaria just refers to low atmospheric pressure as you would experience at altitude. Hypoxia refers to low oxygen in the atmosphere. And then hypoxemia refers to low oxygen in the blood. So at altitude, the fraction of oxygen stays the same in the air. And I'm hoping that you know this number is 21%. It's the partial pressure of oxygen that decreases because atmospheric pressure decreases. So that's what causes hypoxia at altitude. It's because you have a reduction in atmospheric pressure. There's two terms that you'll come across if you go into the altitude literature, and that is normal baric hypoxia versus hypobaric hypoxia. Hypobaric hypoxia is what you experience at altitude because of the reduced atmospheric pressure, whereas normal baric hypoxia is often done at sea level to simulate altitude. And at sea level, it's difficult to reduce your atmospheric pressure. So at sea level, to achieve hypoxia, usually they reduce the fraction of oxygen in the air. So they deliver a lower percentage of oxygen to a participant. And that's referred to as normal baric hypoxia. Your atmospheric pressure is normal, but your percentage of oxygen in the air is reduced. So this is a way to simulate altitude at sea level, whereas at altitude, at real altitude, it's actually hypobaric hypoxia, where your atmospheric pressure is reduced and your fraction of oxygen in the air stays the same. So the partial pressure of oxygen in the air is equal to the fraction of oxygen in the air, so that's 21%, times the atmospheric pressure. So at sea level, the partial pressure of oxygen in the air is around 159 millimeters per mercury, and that's simply taking 21% multiplied by 760, which is your normal atmospheric pressure. You can see the difference at Mount Everest. At the peak of Mount Everest, your atmospheric pressure is only 200 millimeters per mercury. So if you multiply your fraction of oxygen in the air by 200, then your partial pressure of oxygen in the air is only 42 millimeters per mercury. So the driving pressure to get oxygen into your lungs is dramatically decreased at really high altitudes. So I try to illustrate it with this diagram, where you have normal atmospheric pressure, your partial pressure of oxygen in the air is 159. Your alveoli usually have a partial pressure of oxygen of about 100. So the driving pressure there, the difference is about 59 to get oxygen into your lungs. Whereas at extreme altitude, this is at Mount Everest, you can see the partial pressure of oxygen in the air is only 42. The alveoli contains a partial pressure of oxygen of 35. So now your driving pressure is only 7. So your driving pressure, the difference between atmospheric and alveoli PO2 is dramatically reduced. So it's more difficult to get oxygen in your lungs at altitude for this reason. This graph just shows you how your maximal oxygen uptake is affected at different altitudes. So you have sea level, you have say a well-trained young individual with a maximal oxygen uptake of about 50. Mexico City, you can see it's quite reduced, probably by about 10%. And I'm showing you that because they once held the Olympics in Mexico City and it really messed up a lot of the endurance events. This place in Chile is the highest altitude where people actually live. You can see that chops your VO2 max almost in half. And then at Mount Everest, you can see your VO2 max is down to about 10. Recall that you need a VO2 max of about 15 to maintain functions of everyday activity. So with a VO2 max of 10 at Mount Everest, if you're just crawling around, you would be right at your VO2 max. So it would actually feel very difficult. You would be out of breath if you were just crawling around on the peak of Mount Everest. VO2 max starts to decrease at 300 meters of altitude in elite athletes. The question here is whether VO2 max is higher or lower, whether it starts to decrease at a higher or lower altitude for non-athletes. For non-athletes, VO2 max doesn't start to decrease until a higher altitude. So elite athletes, elite endurance athletes seem to be more affected, more sensitive to low altitudes. The reason for this is that if you think about an elite athlete with a high VO2 max, they're going to have an extremely high cardiac output. And with a high cardiac output, you're going to be delivering blood throughout your body at a very fast rate. And so when the blood comes back to the lungs, it's going to be flowing past the lungs at a very high rate. And it's not going to have enough time to pick up sufficient altitude or sufficient oxygen when you're at altitude. Whereas a non-athlete with a lower VO2 max and a lower maximal cardiac output, the blood will be flowing back slower to the lungs and it has more time to pick up oxygen. So anything that compromises oxygen delivery to the lungs is going to affect an elite athlete more, just because the blood is flowing past the lungs faster with an elite athlete. You can see the VO2 max decreases by about 0.6% for every 100 meters of elevation. And your actual VO2 remains similar during work at altitude and sea level. This is if you're not working at VO2 max. So any submaximal work, your VO2 is actually the same. So the question here is, why does work at altitude feel more difficult? And the reason why work at altitude feels more difficult, you can see the green represents the same VO2 at a submaximal work rate at sea level and altitude, but your VO2 max is dramatically decreased at altitude. So for the same level of VO2 at altitude, you're working at a greater percentage of your VO2 max and a lower percentage of your VO2 max if you're working at the same VO2 at sea level. So at altitude, any submaximal exercise will feel more difficult just because you're working at a greater percentage of your VO2 max. In these next couple of slides, I'm going to go over how someone adapts to altitude exposure. So this is acute altitude exposure. So if you go up a mountain right away, you start to feel nauseous, so you start to feel sick. Your heart rate increases and your ventilation increases, and that's in an attempt to compensate for the reduced oxygen that's coming into your lungs. So to get adequate oxygen delivered to your muscles, your heart rate and your ventilation increase. What happens to blood volume? It decreases, and it decreases because as your ventilation increases, you start to exhale water vapor, so you start to lose water vapor, you become dehydrated easily, and your blood volume starts to decrease. That will in turn decrease your cardiac output because you have less venous return because of the reduced blood volume. Because you have a reduced blood volume, your percentage of red blood cells increases, so your hematocrit increases. That makes your blood thicker, and that's going to increase your total peripheral resistance because it gets more difficult to pump thicker blood around your circulatory system. Your blood pressure is equal to your cardiac output multiplied by your total peripheral resistance. Because your total peripheral resistance goes up so much, your blood pressure will end up increasing, despite the fact that you have a reduction in cardiac output. So recall that blood pressure equals cardiac output multiplied by total peripheral resistance. In this case, it increases because of the huge increase in total peripheral resistance. And another symptom that you experience on acute altitude exposure, or some people experience, is headache. So one of the most hazardous risks of altitude exposure is what's called high altitude pulmonary edema. And this occurs because of the increase in blood pressure. So if you get a dramatic increase in blood pressure with acute altitude exposure, it forces fluid out of the circulatory system and into the lungs, and your alveoli fill up with fluid, and it's just like a person is drowning, despite the fact that they're not underwater. So that's often a fatal condition that people might experience if they have an extreme reaction to acute altitude exposure. This slide goes over what happens if you start to acclimatate to altitude. So full acclimatization takes about 12 weeks. You'll still have a decrease in plasma volume, but your body starts to increase secretion of a hormone that's produced in your kidneys called erythropoietin. And this is an attempt to compensate for the lack of oxygen delivery to your muscles. Erythropoietin is this hormone that stimulates the increase in hemoglobin and red blood cells. And you get some increase at the 10 to 12 day mark. Your blood pressure stays elevated. This hemoglobin increases and it increases your oxygen carrying capacity, and that's to compensate for the reduced oxygen that you're breathing in at altitude. You might get increased mitochondria and capillarization at the muscle, and again, that's to compensate for the reduced oxygen delivery. You'll get increased myoglobin, that's that oxygen transport protein inside your muscles. And the last thing you get here is this increase in this metabolite that's called 2,3-diphosphoglycerate. This is a metabolite that's produced in red blood cells. So you get an increase in this metabolite because you have an increase in red blood cells. And this metabolite will cause a shift in the oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve to the right, so that you get more oxygen released at the muscle at altitude because of this. And I'm going to go over this in more detail in the next section.